All right, welcome back to part 2 of fixing Nate's Mazdaspeed 6. So if you watched the first episode, you saw that we had replaced the rear exhaust manifold, turbo, and downpipe. And we pulled off the intake manifold. We ported and polished a spare one I had. We had a whole nother fuel rail. We got the Cobb fuel injectors that we're going to be putting in. But today, so far, what we've done is we tightened up the downpipe, put the new O2 sensors both up here and one down below. I tightened up the exhaust at the downpipe to the intermediate pipe, the mid pipe. What else? We have replaced the oil filter and cooler mechanism. So the old one was pretty rusted, and it was the old paper cartridge style. So Nate went ahead and bought this external screw-on style oil filter, and these 3 bolts you see here are going to be for gauges that he bought for oil pressure and oil temperature sensor, just for the oil itself. We also replaced the clutch slave cylinder because the other one was pretty rusted looking and deteriorated. Replaced some lines here, put a steel braided line in up to there. We already replaced this AC line that goes up around the back of the engine. And that's it. So we also put some valve cleaner down in the valves. I don't know if you could see that or not, but we wanted to get that cleaned out in there. So we cleaned those all out, letting those soak overnight. We'll come back and clean this all out and get the old fuel injectors popped out, put the new cork sports in, attach the fuel rail, and then get ready to mount the intake manifold. And then from there, we'll work on pulling the coil packs out again and swapping out the valve cover. So let's keep going. Stay tuned. All right, so I have already mounted up the new alternator. You can see it down here. New alternator's in. It's all wired up. We also ran the new O2 sensor from the back all the way back up here, and the O2 sensors are all plugged in. Cleaned out all the valves. The valves are pretty bad. I cleaned them out as good as I can, and I've removed the old fuel injectors, and I'll show you here. These are the cork sport injectors. Let me see if I can get a good view on that. There it is. So these are the new cork sport injectors. So those are going in right now.
And you get high as it goes in here.
All right, so I got all the cork sport fuel injectors all mounted up. We also mounted up the radiator hose that goes from the thermostat down to the splitter down here. I pulled off the old serpentine belt. And what else? Oh, we grounded out the sensor for the oil pressure sensor, the aftermarket oil pressure sensor, and oil temperature sensors all wired up. Nate ran that all up through the car. So we've done that. Let's see. Now we're going to mount up the fuel rail. Got the fuel rail ready. Where are you at? Let's get this fuel rail on. Here she is. All right, I'm going to mount this thing up real quick. All right, so we went ahead and mounted up the fuel rail, tightened everything up, mounted up the new, not new, but cleaned up intake. That's all done. The fuel lines are all hooked up. Now we are going to mount the power steering pump back on. That bolt's up right here. Got to remove this one bolt. I'm going to go through and start plugging things in underneath. Map sensor has to get plugged in. The fuel rail will get plugged in once we do the valve cover. Once we do the valve cover, the same harness that goes to these 4 coil packs comes down into this harness here for the fuel rail. So I'm going to go ahead and start working on that. All right, so I've mounted up the throttle body, the EGR tubes going all the way back. That's mounted up. Nate put new clamps on the coolant lines for these things here. Got one new clamp on the front. I'm going to put a new one on the back. This guy just plugs in right here. Push this thing in, and this guy goes in like that. Hooked up all this. We haven't hooked up any of the top stuff here because we're about to pull the valve cover off. So I've already unbolted all the bolts from the valve cover, and I'm going to see if I can pop it off. And she's not budging, so give me 1 second. So I got the valve cover off. We replaced the VVT solenoid right here. We just cleaned off all the surfaces, And we're getting ready to put the new gasket on. All right, so we got the valve cover on, the new coil packs on. Ran all the harnesses to the coil packs, to everything basically. So everything's on as far as sensors and whatnot. We mocked up the front end. So we got the front end on, the radiator core supports on, just with 2 bolts on the bumper. We bolted up the crash bar to the radiator support, so that's mounted on. We still have to come through and tighten everything up, like to the fenders, put the bolts on the crash bar to the frame, all the way around. And this is it for the night, but next we're gonna tighten up the clamps for the lower radiator hose. The new upper radiator hose is in right now, you can see that. The lower one, you can see is down there. I have to mount that one on still. Everything else is plugged in. We have to tighten up a bunch of little things and go through and start doing a checklist, making sure we got everything done. All right, so what I just finished doing right now was I drilled out 2 holes for the mounting points on the new Mishimoto intercooler right here. So it's just got 2 bolts on the top, or 2 thread points on the top here. And I'm gonna bolt it straight through the bumper and see how it supports with all of the tubing attached. Once all the tubing's attached, I'm gonna see if I'm gonna need to fabricate a lower bracket for it to see how that goes. But all the tubing's right here for the turbo, for the intercooler right here. I'm getting ready to mount up the turbo inlet, the one that goes right back into there. So the one that goes, where are we at in the camera here? Yeah, right. So right there, I'm gonna mount the one that goes right there right now and see how that looks. And after I mount that, we're gonna work on working these vacuum hoses back here. So there's 2 hoses, 3 hoses actually. Right? No, 2 hoses that come off of this internal wastegate. So this actuator on the outside has 2. So we removed the factory turbo solenoid, and we have an aftermarket solenoid that we're going to attach to run the aftermarket gauge for it. So I'm going to work on getting the turbo inlet on, and then I'm going to work on getting these hoses on. Well, like I said, I'm trying to mount this up. So this goes around the factory harness. That goes up to the fuel injection harness and coil pack harness. So what I'm trying to do right now, as you can see, it's on the turbo inlet right there. So I'm just trying to push this up and over. And you can see the clamp is also here. I'm going to slide that guy in and then see if I can get a screwdriver straight down through back here to tighten it on. All right, so I mounted up the turbo air inlet. It is sitting on the intake for the turbo side of the air intake side of the turbo. I'm gonna see if I can get a long screwdriver down there and tighten that up. All right, so right now we're mounting up the intercooler. Originally we drilled through the whole crash bar to mount massive studs to go down into these mounting points on the Mishimoto intercooler. But we were saying that it's sitting too low, so Nate figured out an idea to fabricate some brackets to mount to the top of the crash bar and then to hang over, and this actually raises it up about 1.5 inches higher. So we're going to try that and see if we can mount it from the bottom also. So let's go ahead and continue working on mounting up the top. All right, so Nate and I just figured all the routing for this J-pipe coming off the inlet side for the throttle body. So that's mounted up to the intercooler. Comes up through the rubber hose here, like that, you can see. And we've tightened up this clamp back here. That's tightened up. And then we come up in here, and we've tightened up this guy that comes up to the throttle body pipe, the inlet pipe. We've mounted the blow-off valve, and we're gonna still mount the hose that goes from here to here. That's this guy right here. This guy just goes like that, goes down to that pipe there and here. But this turbo inlet pipe right here, I gotta actually pull it off so I can work on the vacuum hoses in the back with more space. So I'm gonna end up pulling this guy off just to get more room back there while I'm working on those vacuum hoses. So next, before I work back there, I'm actually gonna work on connecting the turbo hot pipe right here. So the exhaust side of the turbo, for the turbo hot pipe coming up through here, we're gonna connect it to that. It's gonna come behind here and then down onto this side here. So let's take a look at that. I'm gonna mock up the headlight just to see where the piping is real quick. All right, so right now we're hooking up the vacuum hoses. You can see I pulled off this rubber inlet to give us more space in the back. So we're taking that hot side to this T that Nate just made here. So the T, we cut a T out for it because this this plastic white T that you see in here, that's going to go off to the dash gauge for the turbo boost gauge. So we're going to mount this up to that lower hose right there, and then we're going to mount it up to the turbo solenoid, and we're going to take another vacuum hose off that same solenoid, and it comes down to this vacuum here on this inlet. So let's go ahead and get going with that. All right, so we got all the vacuum hoses hooked up to the turbo solenoid back there. We got all the hoses hooked up down there. We just hooked up the battery tray, hooked up the air inlet tube up to the PCV valve right here. So that's hooked up. Nate just used the K&N air cleaner to spray out the air cleaner. Next, we're going to start working on putting the air intake on, and then we're going to work on the hot side of the turbo. All right, so we finished routing the hot side of the turbo to the intercooler. Got all the ducting in place down behind the headlight. All the clamps are in place. Hot side in, and as you saw earlier, we finished the cool side into the turbo. Hooked up the mass airflow. Charging the battery up right now. I topped off the oil and antifreeze before I topped off the oil. I actually left the oil plug out purposely to flush out any other excess cleaner that was in the engine for me cleaning the valves out a couple weeks ago. So we're gonna go ahead and let the battery charge up and prime up the fuel injectors and see if she'll crank over and stay running. Probably gonna see some smoke because of all the cleaner that went through the valves. We're running no catalytic converter or resonator now. It's 3-inch exhaust all the way back. Yeah, let's see what happens. All right, verified everything was plugged in. All the harnesses are plugged in, but it is not starting. We've turned it over a few times. I checked for fuel pressure. I released the air out of the lines for the fuel at the high pressure fuel pump and at the fuel rail. We checked the spark plugs, and there was no spark coming out of the spark plugs on the coil pack. So we chased back to the fuse and relay box, both underneath the dash and out here under the hood, and everything is good. So there's got to be one harness or a ground or something that's just not connected. I'm going to try testing power at each coil pack to see if there's power getting there as the key's turning. All right, so we went through, checked the coil packs as you saw earlier, and it was getting power, but it wasn't getting ignition power like the actual sparking when you turn the engine over. So Isaiah had recommended checking the grounds, and we had checked the grounds before, but this time what we did was I ran the ground side of a power tester to the positive of the battery, and you go around checking power. And then when I checked this here, the light was super dim. So I ran a ground wire just by holding the wire to this screw to the battery right there, and I noticed that I was getting a bright light rather than a dim light. So now what I did was I actually jumped another wire to the same ground tablet and then regrounded it back here behind the high pressure fuel pump, and we're getting that solid bright light back here, solid bright light here, and we're gonna go ahead and test it again right now and see what it does. Okay, so it started. Let's see if it does it again. All right, so it's starting but not staying running. All right, let's see what else.